So good morning, everyone, and our welcome to Aria Arbashai and Dieter Leysen. Aria and Dieter are part of the practice known as 51N4E, and that is based in Brussels and rooted in Europe. The office works as a platform to organize and support design process and culture at different scales by involving and empowering local communities in contemporary context occupied by multiple and parallel realities. To better deal with the complexity of nowadays transformation processes, the office is internally divided in 3 studios that are ACT, of which Dieter and Aria are part of, I think, and CAST and ROOT. So the studios and the programs in which each studio is then internally organized, faced with a specific vision on particular topic, such as, for example, adaptive infrastructure, performative landscape, and transformative densification. And then they coordinate and complement together between each other, sharing common values and approaches toward transformation. So thank you very much for being here with us, and I pass you the microphone on the stage.
Thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be in Torino, a great city we were able to discover yesterday. And thanks also for the link between your program and our practice. I think the topic of Mind the Gap and the interdisciplinary question that you're investigating as a team is something that we live with every day. As you already explained a bit, we build our office around. So I'll give a short intro to our practice, of which I'm part about 10 years, and then Aria will do a deep dive in one of the projects that we realized just recently. And I'm very curious to hear your own reflections or experiences in our field. I think we can go to the presentation. I'm starting with some pages of the 51N4E manual. It's a book that we realized a couple of years ago, and that explains to newcomers, to people entering the office, how we work. And this image symbolizes the intertwinedness of the different studios and expertises. ACT working on urban questions and going from brief preparation, master planning to a community-related work. CAST working on architecture and reuse mostly of buildings, and ROOT on the ecological question. This is all supported by what we call the 51N4E platform, which is the support or the shared values that we as a group of about 60 people now share. And most importantly, a series of programs which define the shared direction, the inquiry, the destination that we want to go to. They're called adaptive infrastructure, civic design, transformative densification, open public structure, metropolitan hybrids, nature in buildings, and performative landscapes. And to make this a bit more concrete, I'll give some of our work, in which you can see that the scales in which these 60 people are working is extremely broad and diverse, from the extension of an old row house in the city of Leuven, opening up the living environment to the student compound next door by sharing a garden and a greenhouse. This would be part of the transformative densification program, to the renewal and extension of an old factory in the city of Kortrijk, Buddha factory, in which an entrance pavilion was added, an interior large central space made this very sort of dark and old factory into a quite light structure that is until today ever changing. So users change, users change. And it's a good example of what we understand of an open public structure. So a public building that is more of a casco, in which uses can change and evolve over time. Then we move to our more territorial work in the adaptive infrastructure program, where we're doing a lot of work on infrastructure planning and both in green infrastructure as road infrastructure as water infrastructure, with a very broad range of stakeholders, from administrations to action groups to local communities living around those infrastructures. And as you can see here, a broad sort of layering of topics is addressed, from CO2 emissions, where we're going to come to in a bit, to land take, to the mobility question, the modal shift, topics like sustainable energy, and especially the evolutions in those topics. And by using our skills as architects and urbanists, we model possible futures in order to prepare the brief for those projects. In the previous project that you could see in the image, it's a long road, but also the different residential and recreational cores, the valley structures, the non-humans who are using the space, to map this and to also discuss it in a more democratic and low threshold way. Then a project which, in our belief, could result out of these processes, or Skanderberg Square in Tirana, where the central square of the city is transformed from a roundabout, a mobility infrastructure which was not appropriated by humans, to an open square surrounded by a series of gardens, in which now many popular and human uses are being developed. So here you can see how the different buildings around that square suddenly got an address, a small garden, pockets of green, in addition to a water structure that runs from the tip of the square, which is a soft pyramid, to the edges. And then we jump scales again to work in our civic design program, where the last 5 years, I think, we developed an approach of temporal occupation, mostly in Brussels, where we aim to test certain new uses in areas that are or in transformation, often very monofunctional areas that don't have a lot of cultural or social uses, and we introduce other types of spaces, but as a sort of intermediate use. This is the project of Stam Europa, where we, with very limited means, like a curtain, a grid, a series of tables, introduced a social space on the ground floor of a former office building as a prototype for other office buildings, other realizations to follow. And a similar exercise we did in the skyscraper, the World Trade Center in Brussels, where we made a scenography in the Casco floors. But at the same time, we're working on the renovation of this building, and learning from the temporal occupation, translating it into design is an approach that we hold very near to our heart, or to our methodology, and where the scale of the territorial, of the bigger urban question, and the scale of the very the tactile, the experience of the space and of the materiality come together. So these different projects here symbolized with the black dots, they are part of a program, they're part of a studio, and it's a sort of ever-evolving ecosystem of topics and people, supported by a support system in which we try to innovate, we try to get projects as a group, we share resources, and we share people. And it's always very important to represent the bigger group. So we're just two out of a group of 55 people, working very intensely and devoted on these projects in a space that we're now developing. And if you're ever in Brussels, you're very welcome to visit, in which we also try to bring our work to the broader audience. It's located in the North Station, in the North District, which is a district itself in transformation, where we where we take up a role as architects, as urbanists, as activists. Hereby, I move to the second part, where Arya will explain the project Soil and People.
Hello, it works. Nice to meet you all. I will be telling you about the project that we did for a bigger project called Luxembourg in Transition, which was initiated by the Ministry of Energy and Spatial Planning in Luxembourg. The theme of our focus was soil and people. And we did this together with many collaborators, other offices in different disciplines, such as engineering, offices in transport and energy, participation specialists, behavioral change specialists, landscape designers, local architect 2001, and us as urbanists. And I'm going to tell you why we ended up camping with a nutritionist, a farmer, and the people who are listed here under a highway to talk about diet change. This country, Luxembourg, to give you a bit of context, is famous for its world-class cow-related industries. One of the things that it's famous for, export of meat and dairy. And the minister said, the cows in other European countries are second-class citizens compared to our cows, which I believe is true. And some of the key challenges that the country is facing today in relation to climate is that it has the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in Europe. It has one of the highest overweight rates. The citizens eat a lot. Meat production exceeds, it produces 40% more than it consumes. And only 2% of its farms, for example, practice organic farming. And the question that we were asked as spatial planners was to define quantifiable decarbonization pathways for the Luxembourg territory through spatial planning. This is everything your architecture education prepares you for. So we had to learn how to quantify our decisions. It's something that we don't usually do in our projects. It's about decarbonization, a topic that we're not specialized in. And it's about the scale of the territory, not only Luxembourg as a country, but the other territories that it relates to in terms of its emissions. And I often fantasize about this moment of apocalypse in the world where we are leaving Earth and I go in the spaceship, they ask me, so what can you do for us? And I know that architecture is not going to help me in this situation. So I'll ask, what is your problem? Because I think as architects in our education, we learn how to detect patterns in complex problems. We learn to create a story that maybe everyone agrees with. So we can adapt to different problematic situations and find common ground and find a way forward. And I think this is one of those situations. It's exactly that spaceship. So we started to learn. The first task that they asked us to do in the first phase was to define our metrics of evaluation. The metrics was basically the lens through which you quantify. But before we do that, we had to learn about decarbonization. So we looked at different reports, timelines, pie charts, and many different data sets to dig through Excel sheets within the United Nations, the European Union, the Luxembourg itself, and learn about all these different sectors that have an impact on our carbon footprint. And through that, which was a maybe 2-month-long process, we decided that our focus in this project would be on nature-based solutions and lifestyle solutions. This is about soil and people. So the theme that we committed to in the beginning resonated still. To explain you a bit what you're seeing on the picture, this is what is called the 1.5 life pathway that the EU, the European Commission, has devised for all EU countries together. They have looked at, I think, 7 or 8 different scenarios. Out of these 8, 6 of them are the 2-degree scenario, where by 2050 we reach 2 degrees. And two of them reach 1.5, which means carbon neutrality by 2050. And the way you reach neutrality is not only by reducing your emissions, but also increasing your negative emissions. There are two ways you can do that. It's artificial or it's nature-based. So today I'm going to tell you a lot about the nature-based negative emissions. What are negative emissions? Negative emissions are basically ways to capture CO2 from the air and put it back into the ground. A lot of the activities that we do the opposite. But there is processes, artificial processes that we can capture carbon from the air and either feed it into deep sinks that we find or use it in processing, such as there is carbon negative concrete now, or algae farms, they can use carbon. So there are such processes. And there is the nature-based processes that already exist, such as forests, peatlands, and so on. One of the differences that is important to mention is also the cost per ton of carbon between these two operations. So the nature-based solutions today are much cheaper than the artificial. With that, we start to look at the factors by which this negative emission is being informed. Interestingly, the most impactful driver is what we eat on a day-to-day basis, because the food we eat needs vast amount of land to be produced, especially if we talk about dairy and meat products. So excessive food consumption habits in combination with intensive agricultural practices are leading to deforestation. And on top of that, many of our cities are also sprawling. So the rate of land take is increasing. We're reducing the footprint of our landscapes. At the same time, our dietary habits are also taking up more of what is left, and very little is left for our forests. So these are the 4 factors around soil that we identified that we can work on. And most of them relate to land use. So that will be what we will focus on. We also have to define a methodology. To put it in simple terms, the methodology has 3 steps: to count, to identify moments of change, and to scale those moments of change. To count. I told you about the 4 factors. And we developed almost an algorithm that is a land management tool. It relates the state of affairs in the country, such as current land use, current population, current negative emissions, carbon footprint per food type, land use per diet type. And it adds to that the population shift that is being forecasted and a diet shift that we add as our key intervention. So I will tell you later about a bold diet shift that we designed. And this diet-driven land use proposal, on top of that, we add the farming practices that we are imagining that can shift. And together, they lead to the land use and diet-driven decarbonization pathway. So this is the way we count. We show the parameters, and at the end, you will have a spatial byproduct, which is quantifiable in time. The second step was a menu of scalable strategies. These strategies each have an impact. And sometimes they correlate to each other, sometimes they are isolated in their impact. But what was key was that we had to think about the whole country, the whole territory. So to be able to think about one strategy that could be applied to the whole territory in a very short time span, because we couldn't study all of the territory, we had to identify problematic patterns that keep repeating across the territory. What you see below are 2 maps of patterns that we identified. One of them is of rural sites, which I will come to later, and the other one is suburban sites. And the strategies that we had identified on the territorial level, we show a test case in a rural and a suburban case, and show the other areas in Luxembourg that the same principles can be applied. And lastly, to scale. We realized that to be able to, for this project to have a legacy, for it to continue to grow, continue to work, we need to, first of all, understand the context much better in conversation with a lot of people in different sectors, but also those same relationships can scale up, can help the project have a legacy. And this is what we call the Academy of Decarbonization. There's many series of conversations that we had with farmers, with mobility experts, with planning experts in public sector, in private sector, with developers, with citizens. They all manifested themselves in this academy. We know that education about decarbonization is maybe the most important first step across sectors. And the diagram you see here on the right is an adaptation of multi-level perspectives on transition by Hales in 2002. And it shows how small innovations through coalition building, education, raising awareness, and so on, can slowly transform the regime and the landscape that we are living in. So small innovations, individual actions matter. And each of them play a role in a territorial transformation. Now, coming back to our spatial question, globally, we're facing a 600 million hectare land gap by 2050. Luxembourg today has a land deficit 2.5 times its size. It uses 2.5 times its size for the food that it consumes. And these bring questions such as, can we sustain growth without taking land? What and how much do we eat? How do we grow our food? And how much land surface is left then for our forests? To show a bit what this means, you can see the 3 diagrams of land flows. The first one is the situation today. Red is land take and new buildings. Green is forest, the high green. The shorter green is, let's say, the food production, the crops. And in blue, you see sequestration capacity. Sequestration is a negative emission capacity by natural processes. So if the current land take rates continue and our food consumption habits don't change, we will further externalize in business as usual, the second row, the land footprint that we have outside our country for food production. The rate of land take within the country also reduces the size of our forests, the footprint of our forests, and it can even put the neighboring countries under pressure, as it is the case in Luxembourg. But if we start to think more creatively about density, if we start to think and have more awareness of the choices we make in our diets and also our food production processes, we can potentially contain the footprint that we have to the boundaries of our regions. Of course, this has many implications, but we'll get to that later. The solutions or the strategies that we talked about are 6 items. I will spend more time today talking about the bold diet and TDR, which is transferable development rights, and very shortly explain the other ones as well. The bold diet. So, because we talked about the nature-based solution processes and lifestyle changes, diet change has the ability to parachute our negative emissions. The impact of it is extremely high. To put it in a picture, 34% of global emissions are food related. And out of this 34%, 83% comes from meat, dairy, and eggs. Again, out of the 34%, 71% of it is about land use and agriculture. An omnivorous diet, which includes everything that you can eat, you don't choose to not eat something, takes about 1 hectare per capita per year of land, compared to a plant-based diet, which requires 1/7 of that land. And that is the difference that we're talking about. So we mapped the current diet of Luxembourg today. And in this diagram, you see a kind of binary division. If we put the very different diets that exist today in Luxembourg in 2 silos, one silo being the omnivorous and the other silo being the plant-based. Today, the Luxembourg citizens eat about 1 meal of plant-based diet per week. The rest is omnivore. And based on the changes that we see, the generational shift, the global trends, the statistics, we anticipate, and it's an optimistic anticipation, that by 2025, we can get to 1 day per week of plant-based diet. By 2035, half of the week plant-based or equivalent. And by 2050, 6 days a week. The reason we called it the bold diet and not the plant-based diet is to keep this, to show that this ratio is open, is still not fully plant-based, but also to take into account the advances that are being made in, for example, synthetic beef, in cashew nut-based cheese, in all the different types of products that you can have that are not necessarily plant-based, but could have a plant-based footprint. And with this shift, we can see the reduction in the agricultural land footprint of Luxembourg. So on the left, you see the situation today, plus the extra land that it needs outside the country. And with the bold diet, you have minus 3.3 million hectares that are released. I have to first explain this. And out of that minus 3.3 million hectares, a lot of it was outside Luxembourg. The ones that inside Luxembourg, we plan to reforest them because that was the ambition, to have the maximum negative emissions possible. So with the 500,000 hectares of pasture within Luxembourg that was released, we start to see how can we work with this available land. It becomes an empty piece of a puzzle in the land use management. Where do you introduce new forests? Which agricultural lands would you relieve from food production? And that in itself was a very interesting exercise. Would you concentrate more food production closer to cities to reduce the mobility distances? Or would you bring forests closer to cities to help leisure, air quality, and so on? So you can see how the diet shift changes from 2022 to 2050, with omnivore in pink reducing and bold diet in green increasing. In relation to that, you see the land use footprint decreasing for the agriculture. And in this diagram, you can see that by 2045, Luxembourg can reach food autarky, meaning that it can produce the food that it consumes within itself. And here you can see the emissions related to that, the food emissions related to that, which then shows us that by 2040, we can reach net zero food emissions. Of course, we're not talking about the other emissions because the other teams that were involved were working on the other emission sectors as well. We focused on food and negative emissions. We tested our assumptions also with the farmers in Luxembourg across the spectrum of opinions, some of them very conservative, some of them very open-minded about the current practices. And together with them, we built an actionable timeline. What are the short-term milestones, the midterm and the long-term? What actions can politicians, farmers, and citizens play for us to proceed? So I told you about the bold diet shift and how it can have an impact on the negative emissions. But for that to work, we need to preserve the landscapes that we have. And how can you sustain growth without land take? A lot of times in this project, we face this question of growth. Why do you want to even grow? How do you define growth? And it's a very fundamental topic to discuss, but in a way, the brief implicitly accepted growth. So we were not in a position to challenge that question so much. So we tried to formulate our answers in a way that it can contain both growth scenarios and maybe degrowth scenarios. So we took the business as usual definition of growth and tried to tackle that. So can we grow our cities without land take? This is the Battle of Luxembourg, as we framed it. So this is a land take map showing in plus signs where economic and housing expansion areas are identified. And with the arrows, you see the brownfields and sealed areas that we found that are able to accommodate the same footprint. The rate of land take is very high in Luxembourg. It's 0.5 hectare per day. And one of the main reasons for that is actually the housing expansions. There is a culture of sprawl. Everyone wants their own garden. This introduces a lot of sealed surfaces. You can see the city of Mamre, that how in a generation, a whole field was completely filled with suburban housing. But we believe that every hectare matters, because when you seal 1 hectare, you're holding it or its negative emissions capacity, not for 1 year, but for a span of decades to come. And in about 70 years, that reaches 1 million tons of CO2 if that land was forested. It's a bold statement, the 1 million tons of CO2. So it's about forestry and 1 hectare of land in 70 years. But you can also see the other types of land cover and the sequestration capacity that they have on the left-hand side chart. So what we did here was that we realized the problem starts with the definition of property rights. The cities need to attract populations to get funding from the government. The easiest way that you can attract the population is to build more housing. And the first layer of housing that is most attractive is on the fringe of the city, the small city that Luxembourg has, and it's in agricultural land. So the city starts to draw these lines for permits of development for the first line of farmers across the city. And then they sell or cooperate with a developer to build those housings. And then the housings are being sold to new populations. What happens here is that economic and environmental interests start to go at conflict. On one hand, we know that from a decarbonization perspective, we need to keep those natural land covers, but the economy is pushing us to a different direction. But why is that in a conflict? And that is because of the way property is seen. Everything is seen as one silo, while you can see it in layers. Property can be a bundle of rights. So in the Roman times, this is medieval Roman times. That's the first time I think that property is mentioned in law. And it says that anyone who owns a piece of land, it owns it down to the hills and up to the heavens. That's how vertical they saw it. But today we know that that can be more complex. We can separate the right to owning the land, the right to the development right on top, and maybe even the right to what sits below. The subsurface rights, which were maybe mostly talked about in the beginning of the 20th century in mining operations in the US, today could help us address the sequestration capacity of soil. And this is how we started the conversation with municipalities, with governments and farmers and so on. How can we start to identify density opportunities? The tables that you see here are density tables of Luxembourg. To use the existing frameworks not to harm the farmer's rights for development, but to capture the economic interest of the developer and the farmer, and in the process safeguard the land that that farmer owns for sequestration. So in a business as usual scenario, you can see in the middle, both the arable land and the parking that have a permit will have an almost very low density suburban development. But with transferable development right, we can combine the development right sitting on top of that farm together with the sealed surface and have a more denser development on the sealed surface and open the arable land up for a higher sequestration possibility. How do we define these sending sites and receiving sites? It's a whole other conversation, and it's very specific to localities. But here, for example, you can see the test that we did for Bettendorf, a rural site. The village of Bettendorf on the top left suffers from flooding, and I will come to that later. But the expansion plans of the village, you can see how it shows below, it will grow. First of all, it's an extremely ambitious growth plan, but it also covers many of the arable lands that it has around its center. In the map in the middle, you see how we start to identify those expansion zones as sending zones in pink, and we identify available sealed surfaces or derelict buildings as opportunities for densification in yellow. So that becomes our sending site and receiving site. On the right-hand side, you see the change in the morphology of that village. On the top is the proposal by the village, the PAG, and on the bottom is following the transferable development right process. We had to explore what height is a relatively good height for this rural village without losing its identity. We looked at some historical references in the village to show or talk about the height cap. We tested a bit the capacities And this is the morphology that we ended up with. We also looked at TDR around Europe. The status is because it's very much used in the US. It has a long history, especially in New York. But in the other countries in Europe, it hasn't really taken shape very well. There have been attempts, but not very successful yet or widespread yet. And in conversation with public municipalities and the government, we realized that in Luxembourg, it can be used to, for example, incentivize. We can incentivize it by a bonus system. So if you do that, you can get extra density. It has potential to address long-standing development backlogs. Certain municipalities have permits from decades before, where a different generation of politicians has designed these expansion zones. Now the farmers don't want to give up their rights, but the municipality today doesn't want that area to be developed. So there's a backlog. Those can be unlocked. And even there is potential for trans-municipal exchanges. Some municipalities need to grow, but don't have the area. Some municipalities have the opposite situation. Next to TDR and bold diet shift, we looked at also how the landscape itself can become more resilient. We looked at carbon farming practices such as zero tillage, strip cropping, and so on. How can they contribute to further sequestration? Especially agroforestry is an important one, which sits between farming and forestry. Within forestry, we looked at close to nature forest management. How can we harvest the wood for timber production without harming the biodiversity and ecology of the forest itself? And this is done through something called close to nature forest management. About water retention, how can our interventions also help water retention? Because something that is a blind spot in decarbonization conversations is the water footprint. And we also talked about land use accelerators. These are practices by which we can produce food at a much more land efficient process. For example, an algae farm can produce much more nutrients and also capture much more CO2 than a forest can do. A vertical farm was also another land use accelerator that we discussed. So to bring this further into the process, these are the two cases that we looked at more closely. So until now, I was talking more about the territorial level, but at the final stage of this process, we entered two test cases, one rural and one suburban. The rural case was Bettendorf, which I briefly explained. It suffers from sprawl. It also is prone to flooding. It was flooded heavily during the recent floods in Luxembourg. And the second one is Helfand, an area that has the largest mall in Luxembourg, has a lot of parking surfaces, but also has multifunctional buildings. Again, the density is still quite low. Bettendorf, as I said, is prone to flooding. The area that you can see in dotted green is today agricultural fields that the city has plans to expand housing onto, while that is the first basin that goes under flood. There is loss of arable land. Because of that, the forests around are unhealthy, but it also has an opportunity because the agricultural school is there, so it has an opportunity for local agri-tourism. That basin that is now prone to flooding can also be an opportunity to act as a buffer for the villages after. So if we define a function for it that can capture the excess water during such times, can be a blessing for the village. And because of the available water, they can test new crops. And that was something that we also worked on. This is the business as usual of the municipality plan of the expansion. And as I said, this is the TDR proposal. And that's the historic mill that we use as a reference for our height. And here you can see the land use change that we proposed from 2022 to 2050. And a key intervention here was that that basin that was prone to flooding, we designed an algae farm where the pools for the algae cultivation are never fully filled. And during flooding times, they can act as excess basin for excess water to capture the excess water so that the water doesn't flow into the village. And there are dikes after that algae farm. Another thing that algae does is that it captures a lot of CO2. So with that, we managed to have a very successful decarbonization timeline for the village of Bettendorf. So with TDR, with capturing the excess density, we safeguarded the land take. We switched from farming practices to algae farming practices in that basin to help flooding, but also capture more CO2. With the diet shift, which we already had in mind in that area, we reduced the food production footprint and had more forestry. And together with these interventions, we had a step-by-step plan for enhancing the negative emissions of Bettendorf. And here in this bird eye land use decarbonizing diagram, we can see how the different dynamics are at play. In red, you can see TDR. In yellow, you can see the algae farms. In dotted green, you can see the farming practices that we introduced with silvopastures and so on. And in blue, you can see the forestry. And each of them, of course, comes with a number, which was always an Excel sheet next to our plans. In combination to that, we also addressed this problem of town centers or village centers that were emptying. A lot of villagers were complaining about not having a grocery shop anymore, not having their butcher anymore. But with more density within the village, you can have the, in a way, business opportunities recreated. In Helfand, again, the expansion, the sprawl continues, the same problem. We saw the mixed use in smaller scale as an opportunity to have higher mixed use, but you have a lot of monofunctional single floor sheds as well, which are capturing a lot of the footprint of the land, excessive surface parking too. This is in a way the business as usual, which is a bit of a nightmare in this case. And with TDR here, we had the opportunity, because of the vast landscape and closeness to the city, to start to also think about maybe high-rise as a typology, which is very rare in Luxembourg. It's almost a taboo. But at 20 floors high, we were already pushing the sensitive buttons. And here you can again see a land use change from 2022 to 2050. It's also important to mention that in green, you see the land use change, but in blue and red, you're seeing the soil capacity for capturing carbon, what is called SOC. And the bluer it gets, the more carbon it can capture. And it's a direct relationship between land use and land cover and soil's capacity to capture carbon. So here you can see that overview picture of dynamics with strip cropping at the front in the dotted green, forestry combined with the valley that used to be almost without trees, but here we have it with trees. That we also identified the belt around Luxembourg City, which can also be used for leisure for the communities who live around the areas. You can see in red the land safeguarded from land take, put in position in the towers, in the high rises. And the forest that you see here is actually land for food production. It used to be land for food production, but now the same food production can happen in what used to be a 4-story parking, and now it's a horizontal farm, not a vertical farm. So the food is being produced here, the land is released for forestry, and there's an open air market on the terrace, which maybe I can show a bit later. And this is kind of the image that you see of the valley with the high rises to show that the high rise is not necessarily doesn't have a negative impact if it starts to release land from sealed surfaces, and when you can cultivate the land in such a manner that works in the advantage of the public, food production, and the environment. Here you see a compilation of documents about that vertical farm. So there was a 4-story parking. We had a little refurbishment. We took away some of the floors to have these terraced open air market on the top. We added a housing component next to it with a basement of a vertical farm, which connects to the other vertical farm. And on the right-hand side, you can see a view of the market, of the balcony, of one of the housing units that shows the field, and also below the vertical farm in relation to the market. Below, the diagram shows the different vertical farms around Luxembourg City and the reforested agricultural land that can have an impact on. And this was the necklace I was telling you about, how with this new land use management, because Luxembourg City maybe suffers a bit from lack of leisure, but we defined the leisure built around Luxembourg City with the afforestation projects that were in play due to diet shifts. So in short, I believe this project was maybe the perfect definition of a gap in maybe what we learned as architects to address. Also in the office, it was a compilation of many different programs or ambitions that we have. So it shaped itself a learning cluster for everyone who was part of the project, including Julia, who is an alumni of this university, and she was working with us. Maybe I would also like you to, if you have opinions about how you see your education in relation to projects that you see in practice. Do you see a distance to be overcome by education in architecture? And how do you relate to a project like this or to a question like this? Would you respond to it differently? Would you like to see more of these questions as architects in practice? And I would love to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we open to questions. Yeah, you can come here, please. Yeah.
First, oh, sorry, I need to get closer to the microphone. At the same time, maybe I can do like that. Couldn't find a position. I'm sorry for this. First of all, I really loved the lecture, especially it was not only about architecture, but also on the base of the carbon footprint and how much we consume and what we can do about it. It's such a, let's say, relevant topic that instead of using the architecture itself, like 1960s, creating those monumental sculptures, we are trying to discuss the land use policy, which makes us the architects, not the architecture as we know before, but at the same time politicians, because we are trying to decide those people's land and we are trying to convince them to do something else, and which is really important by education. And I would like to highlight something about the Politecnico di Torino, and we had also really good lecture with professor. We created an inventory for Atelier Schmidt's building, and we analyzed all the sustainable solutions for because it's not only the meat and the, let's say, and the land use, but at the same time, the construction is consuming a lot and it creates a lot of carbon. And I would like to ask only one question, since we have a lot of lectures like this. What could be our role, especially your office's role? It became an incubator, it became a learning center, your office, but what is the new direction of the architecture in your opinion, and what could be the limit of architectural gesture in this case? If it's an infrastructure, it will require a lot of, let's say, steel, concrete, and what is the limit in your opinion, and what could be the span of those projects? Let's say, even though we need to have this, let's say, infrastructure that will be as, for now, as a satellite city, but in the future it's going to be a metropolis, I don't know. And then what could be the span of this infrastructure to not to have this problem in the future with the abandoned ones, for example? Thank you. I can stay here.
Thanks for the question. While the Luxembourg in Transition project focused very specifically on land use and diet, the question of circularity and use of materials is extremely alive in the office as well, where in the city of Brussels, a strong shift from new build to reuse and circular use of materials is happening very rapidly in the last 3 years. I think both in the administrations, on the political and in the practice level, this awareness is growing. And in our sort of, it's a bit in our DNA to look first for reuse of resources and then to look for new. And I think that's where the bridge to the land take question can be made. We indeed need more square meters to host our society, but look first at the parking lot that is not used efficiently before taking land, which is actually extremely important to keep us all alive. So the question of reuse, I think, can be translated on multiple scales and multiple topics, both the territorial as the architectural one. And that's something that is, I think, growing, and we're certainly not alone. We have a big ecosystem of practices like the one that you mentioned here in Torino that are busy with this question, and it's to be encouraged.
Maybe I can also address your comment and question in 3 short answers. I think in the case of Luxembourg in transition, we investigated also in the beginning if we should enter the construction sector as well. Of course, there were many things that we wanted to, and we felt that we could address, but we also had to focus. And that's one of the skills that we also need in very complex projects, to be able to make decisions on where do we close our scope. If a client is asking you to do everything, you have to also say, well, the budget and time only allows for a certain piece. While we're aware of, in a way, a lot of the blind spots that we're still leaving open. You mentioned that we became an incubator, which I agree. I think our office is maybe, I think, that's my personal opinion, is developing more and more into a shape of an open platform, because the times that we live in are unpredictable, and the questions that we receive are, as time goes by, are becoming more and more diverse. So we know that we have to embed a layer of education so that we are constantly re-educating ourselves into new disciplines and new sectors to be able to respond to the questions that we are receiving. And I guess that is also an incubator. It's a place for giving birth to new ideas. And you mentioned the architectural gesture, which I think is a very interesting question. Sometimes I did ask myself, what am I doing exactly in this project? I think I and the office as a whole works with design sometimes as a tool to inspire policymaking. And that doesn't mean to design every detail, but it's about designing the essentials, the story, which can be the beginning of a transformation in a mindset. So the design is not a material design, it's more an attitude design, a mindset design. I think that's one thing that this project did have. Another one, I think that we did, another thing that we did as architects was medium and also a communication principle, because if you see other companies' submissions of this project, they look quite different. So every office in a way developed their own communication language, their own vocabulary, their own charts. And we had to define a medium where citizens, politicians, and scientists can all relate to. And I think this is something that maybe not every profession faces. Our profession sits in between these quite distinct spheres. And lastly, I think the storytelling principle is very important and strong in this project. It's a very sensitive project because of the point that I made prior to this about scientists, citizens, and politicians. The minister who was reflecting on our submission in the second phase on diet change, he said that the last politician who talked about a plant-based diet was, she didn't get a single vote. So we had to be very careful about how we portray this topic. How do we show it? How can we create awareness around it? And how can we tell a story that these three very different parties can come around one table? And I think that's, again, an architectural gesture from my standpoint. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have one question by a student from home. So maybe Gael, you can, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry, I'm like following from home because I'm outside of Italy. First, I want to tell you that, like my colleague said, it's a really interesting question. Interesting lecture, especially that it's also looking into architecture in a different way than we're usually taught how to. So like, you are really like using architecture in different ways and like to change like what's already happening. And also looking at your other works, like your works are like, looking at them, it's clear how you are thinking the notion of architecture, the practice, the methods, and also like your projects are acting as a vector for urban and spatial transformation as like you work on infrastructure adaptation. So looking at these projects and as a student, I would like to know how and like maybe where is the most urgent infrastructure that needs to be changed. And usually like as already architects like working, what are the methodologies and the priorities you address to choose these areas and work for a solution for them? Thank you.
I tried to rephrase your question just to be sure that I understood them correctly. I think you referred to some of our work in adaptive infrastructure and the methodologies how to tackle change on that scale and on that complexity. I think one important frame we need to mention there is the one where our practice was born, which was Brussels and also the Flemish part of Belgium, where in the last 20 years an increasing awareness happened around spatial quality, and at the same time a large resistance against large infrastructure projects. So while from policy point of view, policymakers were trying to raise the quality, on the societal point of view, there was a lot of resistance. Big projects didn't happen, permits didn't go through. So the government had to invent new methodologies, such as the Bouwmeester, which is an institute that happened late 90s to increase architectural qualities in public commissions, or the procedure of complex projects, which is a procedure that was set up by the Department of Environment to discuss large infrastructure projects with a bigger group of stakeholders. So not only within the administrations, with the engineers, with the architects, but with the local governments, with the the community or organizations living around, taking quite some time, sometimes 3 to 4 years, just to collectively create a brief, test scenarios, and like Arya said, also imagine this common future in a more shared way. So we were very sensitive to those both institutional transformations. The Bouwmeester gave 51 Amphori the platform to do good architecture. Some of the projects that I showed in the beginning were realized through this open call system, and the complex project procedure was one of the important support systems of the adaptive infrastructure program. I think that's also very important in those lectures to give credit to those policymakers, politicians that went before us and provided the environment for architects and urbanists to do this kind of work. I think, yeah, on the European level, actually, there is more lessons to be learned from administration to administration to invent or exchange on these procedures, so that good practices can happen here in Italy. Infrastructure, where I think there is a big question on also recent years, and we're just one part of the puzzle, let's say, in this bigger question of adaptive infrastructure.
Maybe I can also add to that about an experience in a methodology is very different from the answer that Dieter gave, because I think Dieter more talked about the ecosystem of our work, and maybe I can mention one tool as the opposite side of the spectrum. And I think that's about designing streams of conversations. So in some projects, we invest more in thinking about what type of conversations and in which frequencies we must have than the project itself. And most notably, it was one time where we had a very large table that was about the iterations, the spatial iterations on a tower project. And on another table, we had pieces that were movable of different roundtables, conversations in small and large groups with politicians, with experts, and with potential stakeholders for the timeline of the project. And it is that presence of seeing the overview of conversations at all times next to the project that helps us to be more agile in the different circumstances that might come up in very complex projects. And I think infrastructure projects are also of such complexity, whereby we always have to have an eye in that role of facilitation that we must play. I mean, I think we take up that role, and we are sometimes given that role directly to facilitate among very different worldviews.
Thank you very much. Then we have Niazi, also from home.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you for the lecture, first of all. I mean, we can see that there's a lot of deep research behind your work. So my question is that, do you think this research result could be considered as a social pattern or social gaining for the future projects, or maybe for other architectural practices?
Can you also maybe write the question, because the audio is not very clear.
Sorry, I'm writing now.
Okay, thank you. Then we will have also Rebecca, who is posing a question. Maybe you can write it, and then we leave you also the floor to speak later.
Is that clear now? Can you read?
I think if I understand your question correctly, is how do we use results of isolated projects as lessons for other projects that we work on, or maybe they can be lessons for other practices even beyond us. And if that is the question, we didn't define so much what a program is in the office, but the reason the programs were born were that projects have a limited timeline, they end, while the questions that we try to identify within a project, the urgencies that we try to identify within a project don't die with the project. So the program is a methodology or a space in which we identify values and questions that we are interested in, and a series of projects fall into that value framework. So they shape the program. The program is a compilation of projects, sometimes simple and complex together, short and long together, that follow the same value framework. And the teams which work within those programs share those value frameworks. It becomes almost small societies around values. And I think the question that you asked, in a way, is responded by the programs that we have, which continue the legacy of each project, because the value is defined beyond the project. If other practices could take this up, or maybe they already have it, that's something that I'm sure there are other practices who also do it, maybe with different vocabulary, because every practice deals with this issue.
And maybe I can add to that in the relation to our practice, where we do indeed architectural projects as well as territorial, as well as scenographies, etc. We also have a couple of very simple formats that allow to exchange amongst the different project groups and programs, which is a weekly newsletter where everybody sends their material or lessons learned from the week, and a breakfast session, which happens about every 2 weeks, where projects like the one on Luxembourg is shown to people working on Highrise competitions, for instance, and they get, in a more informal way, inspired by this work. I think it's always part organized, and it's also part sort of informal exchange that we try to organize in the office, and also by coming here, for instance, we hope to have that kind of exchange.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca, maybe you can pose your question.
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry, my group is attending online. And first of all, thank you very much. We have appreciated a lot your lecture. We had read some articles, and we would like to ask you something about empty spaces in our cities. In fact, in recent years, there are many examples of urban voids or abandoned spaces which have been filled with temporary activities. According to you, could you explain how the temporary use of buildings waiting for a redevelopment affects the decisions of planners, architects, or politicians? I have written the question in chat.
Yes, I see. Thanks for the
Thank
question. We have indeed been busy with this type of work for the recent years, and I think the underlying question in this dilemma is, what do you want to affect, or what change do you want to bring in this type of environments? Often it does have an impact, but it's merely a financial, a sort of placemaking or marketing tool, while in the activities that we've been involved with, the notion of bringing diversity to parts of the city has always been a very important question. To reply your question, is it will always have an impact. The question is, what impact do you want to have? What is the value that you want to show through these projects, and then who do you show it to? In the World Trade Center, for instance, we were in a situation of a vacant office tower in a financial district, where we brought in artists, where we brought in social associations, but we also invited a lot of politicians, developers to experience another type of use. And there, I do believe that there was an impact on the decision taking for a more diverse planning, which doesn't allow monofunctional towers anymore as from now, because of the type of conversation that was organized, the type of meetings that happened, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, and the effect of the temporal use was there. I wrote a paper on it, it's on our website, so it could be interesting if you're really working on that topic specifically to check the paper more in detail, like describe some conditions in which this impact can be held. But the real question again is what do you want to show? What change do you want to bring?
We have also another question from Rebecca, but first of all,
yes, if it's possible, I have another question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if someone in the room also has questions before. No, so you can go.
Yeah.
Rebecca, you can go.
Yes, there is also Federico, who is from my group. Okay. And maybe if you want to say something, Federico, or I can.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is is about the article B401, the city highway reinvented. And I would like to ask, because I see that in many other cities projects that concern existing urban highways or road infrastructures don't seem to be efficiently supported. So how can the B401 viaduct project mentioned in this article actually defend the architectural heritage of Anversa and at the same time assure an efficient urban infrastructure? And also, even though there has been a participatory process, as I read, how people could possibly react to this kind of change?
It was a bit difficult to pick up all the words, Federico. But what I understood was, oh, you have it?
I wrote it on the chat.
I am going to read the question because I didn't completely get it. Okay. The flyover that the article is about is in Ghent, and it's indeed it was a project where the heritage value of such a 20th century infrastructure was a topic of discussion and a very contested one. So some people appreciated this type of infrastructure, others really hated it. And the research by design that we did was a tool to open up minds, a sort of mind-opening experience, to leave some of the old appreciations behind. And we did this through scenario building, something that I think we got quite used to in our discipline, but there was very important to, as a methodology, allow people to look through different glasses than the one that they had been wearing for the course of their life, and to see the infrastructure suddenly as a large sport field or as a long park that penetrates the city from the suburbs to the core. So this research by design was quite crucial to reveal the heritage value of this existing concrete structure. And secondly, again, the temporal use that was organized by the city of Ghent, in which for one day the viaduct, the highway, was a festival site, and everybody could play, go to a concert, just chill out on the viaduct. And for many people, I think it was about there was a big audience walking and dancing on the viaduct. So it changed perception quite drastically for Ghent citizens, and it came at a very for us fortunate moment during our study, where we showed the potential, but the citizens also experienced the potential. So I think lessons to be learned for other cities is this revealing scenarios, but also changing it in directly, like the idea of starting now if you want to transform something in relation to infrastructural heritage is quite important.
And maybe I just add one comment to Dieter's explanation about these highly complex engineering projects and feelings of citizens and residents. It's a very large gap to leap, and it's not always within our capacity and knowledge to address those. So one of those examples and one of those moments where we always try to reach out to some of our established partnerships, and in case of a lot of the Flemish projects of such situations, we work with Ruth Soonen from Simply Community, who's an anthropologist who has worked in the field of architecture a lot, and she helps us with identifying methodologies, anthropological methodologies, methods of engagement. She accompanies us in certain workshops, and she sometimes goes to have one-on-one interviews to understand within this community what are the key issues and challenges that they think are most important. Who are the ambassadors of these communities? How is the best way that we as architects can approach this community? And it's not always about engineering topics. It could also be about complex social issues that somehow touch the urban development projects. But for me, just working with someone like that has been eye-opening in many ways, where we as architects are not really educated to be able to make those decisions in communication.
Thank you very much. We have time for still one or two questions. There is one about metabolism of Albania.
Yes, I have wrote the question in the chat, and we would like to ask you why this country, why this interest in this country.
Yes, I think the in line with my my answer about the complex projects in Flanders and the Bouwmeester, a similar evolution on a political and policy level happened in Albania when our office, I think 20 years, way before we were part of it, entered that context through two competitions, the square and the tower, the TID tower and the Skanderberg Square, and was able to, in relation to this evolving political context, to set up a learning environment with local partners, with politicians, policymakers, schools. The book, The Metabolism, is a good example of a long-term collaboration with that context. And you're very correct that these contexts are also in other locations. So perhaps it was a very lucky encounter these 20 years ago with Albania. And that's also where I think the approach that we discussed about the more incubator attitude of 51M4E fits well with contexts, political contexts that are also incubating new tools, incubating new policy lines, and that's what happened in Albania as well as in Flanders.
And I think that explains maybe the long-term engagement in certain projects created this opportunity to connect it to a learning cluster. And I think books are, for our office, are an opportunity for reflection. Sometimes reflection in collaboration, sometimes reflection internally. And other than Metabolism of Albania, I think more recently in the past years, the office has been publishing the chapters where a reflection occurs within a learning cluster, such as metropolitan hybrids or design in dialogue. And that captures something that also came across in one of the previous questions: how do the lessons translate into other projects and beyond the practice? And I think I forgot to mention that there is also the chapters which capture these reflections. So I think that book is also one of those occasions where the experience in that context, together with a learning opportunity, learning cluster opportunity, resulted in a reflection as such.
Maybe one last, if there is. Yes.
I don't know which year in this field you are in already, but I would like to know, what do you think within architecture education is missing greatly? What is the gap that we need to leap in the field of education? I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that, because we're even in practice, we're behind and we're trying to follow with small learning clusters. But in education, I think the same thing needs to happen. And which gap do you identify as the most urgent one? It doesn't need to be a perfect answer. It's just a
And also at Politecnico, they teach you the traditional way of how to make a building, for example. And attending those kind of lectures, you can see how much the world is actually improving in the architecture field. So I'm like, okay, I'm finishing my study now, but I need to study again how the world is, what is the new world looking to. So that's, I think, the problem right now at Politecnico di Torino, while maybe China is different, I don't know. So that's my point. Anyway.
Thank you. That was a very good answer. And if there are any other ones.
How would you answer to that?
How would I answer?
Yeah.
We have another one. Perfect.
I think it's the field of production, actually dealing with the client, knowing what he wants, what he doesn't want, and trying to basically, you get to a point where you're trying to educate your client to the things you already know, but what he's actually holding on to, just to tell him what is right or wrong. So how do you do that? I think that's something I need.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think both topics mentioned were very relevant. And it comes down to a lot of, I think, social skills in that case, also in the case that you mentioned. And in a way, I don't think any education can prepare you for all the complexities that you will face. You can choose to reduce the questions that you address based on your expertise. You can choose to always work in luxurious interior designs where you have complete freedom. That's a choice. But if you choose to be open, and if you choose to respond to the urgencies that society is looking towards, then you need to be agile in the way you learn. So I think we need to learn to learn. We need to learn to keep an open mind. And I think some of the skills that we implicitly learn in our education process are already preparing us for that kind of climate. While if it was me, I would reduce the emphasis on certain traditional architectural principles and increase more time for just having an insight into different disciplines of maybe anthropology, of policymaking, and so on, because these are the people you will meet. So you need to have a little bit of understanding of where they come from, as you say, on governance, especially because we're operating in cities that are being governed by regulation, but we don't really study that so much. So that would be maybe the gap. Maybe the gap I would think is there, and I would like to still, I'm curious about how that can be educated, is how to afford risk. I think in the discipline of architecture, especially as a young practitioner, that if you want to make ends meet as a young practice, it's very difficult to take risks because there is a very limited margin. And how do we learn where to take risk and where not? Like a risk assessment is something that I would have been curious as a student, and still I am, to learn. And how about you?
I reacted because I was thinking of asking a question to you in this way. And I think what came very clear from your practice and the projects you have been presenting is kind of this ability of the architect to not really to manage, but kind of to direct different voices, but also different people which talk different languages. And it's something which, and also like to learn how to constantly adapt to that. And it's something while looking and researching architectural practices doesn't come over that much. So that's what I really enjoy from your presentation, this ability to show how it was important to do also that, and kind of the Zoom calls and the screenshot to that and so on. So I think from the side of education, I fully agree with this kind of lack of social skills, which are missing sometimes in the curriculum, but also like this ability to kind of deeply know how much architecture is embedded in all the other contingencies, and this ability to talk with that. So this in short.
I think maybe one point to add is the I think a paradigm shift that is happening within the field from looking at structures and buildings very often in architectural schools toward looking at environments, which are much more layered and consists out of human, non-human, technical, biological components, which all make space. And I think we are, as architects, still too little trained to use the ingredients that make an environment. And I don't think a 5-year education allows to learn all these ingredients. So it's a lifelong education almost to make an environment where you can both think about the algae as well as the cost concrete. And within the projects, such as the Luxembourg project that was presented today, it's a sort of education, even though it is work. So don't stress about next year after your master's. You will learn along the way.
Okay, so thank you very much. Maybe we can close now. And thank you for the lecture of today and also for the discussion. I think also the presentation was really on the point with our call for this seminar. And also I think we kind of bridge some gaps today. So between also focusing on very specific project and talking about very general, but also common issues, and also bridging the gap between, I don't know, some practitioners and academic and university environment, feeling more like a community. So thank you very much. And see you.